The chamber hummed with restrained chaos, papers rustling, murmurs clinging to the air like static. Cameras zoomed in, waiting for the spark everyone knew was coming. Senator Elizabeth Warren leaned forward, her voice sharp enough to slice through the noise. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett met her gaze, steady, unflinching, her hands clasped with quiet defiance. The air tightened. Every senator seemed to brace for collision, and then Warren's tone shifted. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, voice measured but clear, "your argument is brilliant." A stunned silence rippled through the room. Heads turned. Pens froze mid-note. Even the press gallery hesitated, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Warren's eyes didn't waver. Crockett blinked once, caught between disbelief and composure. Whispers erupted. Did Elizabeth Warren just agree with Jasmine Crockett? But how did a fierce debate turn into the most unexpected moment of respect the Senate had seen all year? Hours earlier, the chamber had been electric for a different reason. The agenda was clear but volatile, a hearing on economic justice and corporate accountability, where numbers met human lives. Senator Elizabeth Warren sat poised behind her stack of reports, the image of precision and reform. Across from her, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett waited with the intensity of a storm contained, representing the new guard, raw, fearless, unbothered by hierarchy. It wasn't just a policy debate. It was a collision of eras. Warren, the architect of oversight and data-driven battles. Crockett, the voice of lived experience, echoing communities that had long been ignored by both sides of the aisle. Commentators on X, TikTok and cable networks framed it as a generational showdown before it even began. Two powerhouses, one spotlight. Hashtags trended before the first question was asked. Every sentence carried weight, every glance the promise of confrontation. This wasn't about committee procedure anymore. It was about the soul of leadership in a divided America. Would intellect outweigh authenticity? Would legacy silence passion? Beneath Warren's composed exterior, something unexpected stirred. The awareness that brilliance wasn't defined by tenure, but by truth. But before the nation witnessed that moment of praise, there was fire, and it nearly tore the room apart. The debate began with the usual theater, voices raised, chairs creaking, microphones flickering between control and chaos. What was meant to be a discussion on economic justice quickly devolved into partisan noise. A senator from across the aisle smirked as Jasmine Crockett spoke, muttering something about idealism over experience. Another interrupted her mid-sentence, waving off her argument with a laugh that stung louder than words. Crockett didn't flinch. Her posture remained unshaken, her tone steady, her words measured but edged with conviction. "With respect," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the condescension. "If experience means repeating the same mistakes, maybe it's time for a different kind of wisdom." The room shifted. Some scoffed. Some looked down, pretending to shuffle papers. But for the first time she had their full attention. From her seat, Elizabeth Warren observed, arms crossed, expression unreadable. To the cameras she looked detached, almost cold. But her eyes followed every word Crockett spoke, as if weighing the young congresswoman's resolve. The tension between them wasn't spoken. It vibrated beneath every exchange. Outside the chamber, the narrative was already forming. Cable hosts labeled it Warren versus the newcomer. Political blogs churned out clickbait. Two strong women, one spotlight. Twitter erupted with split-screen comparisons, Warren's polished composure against Crockett's passionate defiance. Memes, hashtags, commentary. Everyone chose a side before the story had even unfolded. Inside, the undercurrent was crueler. Senators whispered just loud enough to be heard. "She's ambitious," one said. "Emotional," another added. It was the quiet, systemic dismissal that every woman in politics knew too well. But Crockett refused to shrink. Her frustration simmered beneath the surface, visible only in the tightening of her jaw, the brief pause before her next sentence. She refused to let anger define her. Not here, not in front of cameras that would twist her every gesture into a headline. She chose calm. She chose power in restraint. Warren leaned forward now, jotting a note, her expression softening. The others didn't notice. They were too busy trying to talk over Crockett, unaware that they were becoming the villains of their own performance. The more they mocked her, the clearer it became who held the moral ground. Crockett's words began to shift the tone of the room. Her argument wasn't laced with outrage, but with undeniable truth. She spoke of workers forgotten in policy spreadsheets, of families surviving on promises that never reached their doorsteps. Each line hit harder than the last, not because it was loud, but because it was real. By the time she finished, the chamber had grown uneasy. Even those who had mocked her couldn't hide the discomfort creeping across their faces. And yet, as the murmurs faded, one truth hung heavy in the air. She had held her ground alone, surrounded and unbroken. And then, when it seemed the room was stacked against her, Jasmine turned the tables with a single sentence. Long before the Senate cameras ever caught her fire, Jasmine Crockett was fighting different battles, quieter ones on streets that rarely made the news. In Texas, she was the attorney who took on cases no one else would touch. Women evicted unjustly, young men profiled and punished before proven. Her office was small, her paycheck smaller, but her purpose burned with the kind of heat that couldn't be dimmed by exhaustion or defeat. She didn't come from power. She came from persistence. There were nights when she'd drive home after court with her headlights cutting through silence, wondering if she was making a dent in anything at all. But every client who whispered thank you in trembling gratitude became another reminder. Her voice mattered because it spoke for those who had none. When she first ran for office, the establishment called her too loud, too brash, too emotional. They said she'd never survive the polish and performance of politics. And yet every headline that mocked her fire became fuel. Every insult became armor. She didn't refine her edges. She learned how to make them cut precisely where truth needed to be heard. Her rallies weren't slick productions. They were gatherings of mothers, workers, and students, people who saw in her a reflection of their own defiance. She didn't promise perfection. She promised to fight. And when she spoke, it wasn't the rehearsed rhythm of a politician. It was the raw cadence of someone who believed. In Washington, she quickly learned that truth had a cost. Behind every committee smile was a calculation. Behind every handshake, a hierarchy. But Jasmine never adapted to the game. She rewrote its rules. She used facts like weapons, empathy like armor. Her strength wasn't in experience. It was in the authenticity that couldn't be coached or spun. Critics called her unpredictable. Supporters called her fearless. But those who met her knew the truth. Her fire wasn't anger. It was conviction, the kind that doesn't fade when the lights go off or the cameras stop rolling. Through every challenge, every subtle dismissal, she reminded herself why she was there. For the communities still unseen, for the people who couldn't afford lobbyists, for the kids growing up believing politics was a locked door they'd never be invited through. And so, she pushed again and again until even her critics couldn't ignore her presence. Jasmine Crockett had become more than a congresswoman. She was a symbol of resistance wrapped in grace. But what Jasmine didn't know was that one of the most respected voices in the Senate had been quietly watching and taking note. The noise in the chamber had reached a restless hum when Elizabeth Warren finally leaned toward her microphone. The subtle scrape of her chair silenced the room. Her tone was calm, deliberate but edged with unmistakable command. "Congresswoman," she began, "I appreciate your passion, but the data tells a different story." Her words sliced through the air like measured precision. Charts, figures, decades of research. Warren laid them out with the confidence of someone who had built her reputation on evidence and logic. Her delivery was flawless, almost surgical. Crockett listened, then replied, not defensive, not deferential, but steady. "Senator," she said, "the data may tell a story, but the people living that story are telling another." Her words carried warmth where Warren's carried weight. She spoke of families balancing 3 jobs, of numbers that didn't capture hunger or hope. The air pulsed between them, intellect against intuition, logic against lived truth. Reporters leaned forward. Senators exchanged glances. There was no shouting, no grand theatrics, just 2 women commanding the room in entirely different languages, both impossible to ignore. For a moment it wasn't rivalry, it was recognition wrapped in resistance. A clash that demanded respect even as it burned with tension. And then, Warren did something no one expected. The air in the hearing room had shifted, not violently but unmistakably. The kind of stillness that happens right before a storm breaks, or right before something sacred is spoken. Elizabeth Warren sat motionless, her hands folded neatly on the table. The tension in her face had softened. The lines that once framed fierce rebuttals now seemed to settle into quiet contemplation. Cameras zoomed in. Every lens wanted that expression, the precise moment a battle turned into something else entirely. Warren leaned forward slightly, adjusted her glasses and locked eyes with Jasmine Crockett. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, her voice steady, deliberate, resonant. The room froze. "Your analysis," she paused, letting the words breathe, "is brilliant." The sentence sliced through the thick silence like a beam of clarity. For a moment it seemed no one remembered how to move. Then came the collective gasp, subtle but synchronized, as though the entire chamber had just exhaled disbelief. Warren continued, her tone lighter now, layered with unexpected grace. "You've articulated something most of us have failed to grasp, the moral dimension of what we call policy, the way it touches real lives, the way it echoes beyond numbers and bills. That perspective brings a depth we've too long ignored." Behind her, aides exchanged glances. Journalists hunched forward, typing furiously. Warren praises Crockett, calls her analysis brilliant. The tweet was sent, then shared, then exploded. Within minutes, hashtags began to climb. Warren respect, Crockett brilliance. Crockett herself looked stunned, not by the praise but by the tone. It wasn't political courtesy. It wasn't strategic flattery. It was real. Her eyes flickered downward, as if searching for balance after a sudden wave of gravity. When she looked back up, she nodded once on slow, measured, grateful. The narrator's voice would later describe it perfectly. For a moment, the Senate forgot its lines. Even the reporters, who lived for verbal bloodsport, paused before typing again. This wasn't about a win or loss anymore. It was about recognition, the rare kind that humbles intellect and elevates truth. Warren's next words deepened the moment. "You remind us that justice isn't an equation. It's a human story, and sometimes it takes a fresh voice to remind veterans of that simple truth. It wasn't surrender. It was transcendence. Two philosophies, intellect and intuition, meeting in mutual respect." Cameras caught it all. Warren's faint smile, Crockett's nod, the stunned silence hanging in the air like a note held too long. Outside, the internet did what it always does, amplified the moment. Edits of the exchange flooded social feeds. Political commentators dubbed it the Senate's most human moment of the year. Clips replayed with captions like, "Humility meets truth." In that instant, the story wasn't about rivalry anymore. It was about something larger, the rare collision of two forces who, instead of destroying each other, illuminated what leadership could look like. But what happened after that single sentence made this moment echo far beyond the Senate walls. By the next morning, the moment had already become legend. Every major network replayed the clip in slow motion. Warren's calm acknowledgement, Crockett's stunned nod, the silence that followed. It wasn't just a political exchange anymore. It was a cultural event. News anchors used words rarely heard in coverage of Congress: grace, humility, integrity. CNN called it a masterclass in emotional intelligence. MSNBC ran a headline that read, "Two women, one defining moment." Even the more skeptical networks couldn't ignore the power of it, the image of two strong women choosing respect over rivalry. Online, the reactions were electric. Clips flooded Twitter. This is what leadership looks like. TikTok creators remixed the exchange with music, calling it the most graceful takedown ever. Instagram Reels paired the moment with quotes about empathy and wisdom, while YouTube compilations titled it, "When Truth Silenced the Room." Supporters from both political sides, usually oceans apart, found common ground. "You don't have to agree with Warren or Crockett to admire what they just did," one commentator said on a late-night show. They reminded us that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. Within hours, statements poured in from other lawmakers. Senator Gillibrand tweeted, "What we saw today was courage on both sides, to listen, to learn and to elevate the conversation." A younger generation took notice too. College debate clubs analyzed the exchange. High schoolers reposted clips with captions like, "This is the kind of power I want to have." For once, politics didn't feel divisive. It felt instructive. Warren's praise had become a symbol of generational unity, of intellect meeting empathy, of truth rising above ego. And yet, beneath the applause and the viral admiration, there was a deeper message, one that every viewer, whether in power or not, could take personally. In the end, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about who won the argument or who dominated the floor. It was about what happens when truth meets humility, when power chooses grace over pride. The narrator's voice softens. True brilliance doesn't need to shout. It simply needs to be recognized. Warren's acknowledgement of Jasmine Crockett wasn't a concession. It was evolution, a quiet reminder that leadership isn't about standing taller than others, but about knowing when to lift someone beside you. Both women became reflections of something larger, courage, intellect and purpose converging in a single instant. Warren showed that wisdom listens. Crockett proved that conviction doesn't need seniority to hold weight. Together they reminded millions that respect, even in disagreement, can rewrite the narrative. In a world that rewards noise, dignity still wins, because the truest power isn't in control, it's in acknowledgement. That day, the Senate didn't just witness a debate. It witnessed a shift, from ego to empathy, from division to dialogue. When Elizabeth Warren acknowledged Jasmine Crockett's brilliance, she reminded us all of one simple truth: respect is revolutionary. It wasn't planned. It wasn't polished. It was real. A moment that showed us leadership isn't about overpowering someone. It's about recognizing them. In that Senate room, amid tension and history, two women demonstrated that intellect and empathy can coexist, that humility doesn't weaken power. It defines it. If this moment moved you, share it. Let the world see that grace still has a place in leadership. Comment below if you believe more leaders should lift others like this, not out of strategy, but out of strength. Because sometimes, the loudest victory isn't in the applause or the argument, but in the silence, filled with respect. Fade out. Soft music. The camera lingers on the stillness of the Senate floor. A moment forever frozen in grace.